Good morning. Ray's work and contributions to descriptive psychology have been significant as a prolific writer, lecturer, and professor. He has published over 90 pieces of professional work. Ray's work and areas of interest over the years have focused upon psychopathology, psychotherapy, and various philosophy of science issues. The latest I'm excited to share is his article entitled Establishing Correct Concept Meanings in Psychology. Why should we care and how can we do it? This article was recently approved by the American Psychological Association for publication in their flagship journal, The American Psychologist. Congratulations, Ray. We look forward to hearing from you once again this year and also hearing informally about your newfound excitement for YouTubing.
Good afternoon. I'm Ray Bergner. I'm a professor of psychology at Illinois State University. And my topic this afternoon, and the title of my talk here, is Beyond Outcome Studies, Good Psychotherapy Rests on Many Secure Epistemic Foundations. Okay. So let me begin with a little story. So recently, a speaker came to my campus, and he was speaking on the subject of empirically supported therapies, and basically making a major pitch for how important it is to adhere to ESTs in the doing of therapy. So he used an analogy. He said, supposing, so here's a bunch of students, bunch of faculty assembled here. He's saying, supposing you went to a medical doctor, you had some sort of ailment, and you said to the doctor, so doctor, before we begin, I'm just meeting you for the first time. So are you somebody who reads the journals? Are you somebody who keeps up on current research on, what's the best medication for, the conditions that you're treating, or not? And the doctor replies, well, I'm really experienced, and so I read the journal some, but really not a lot. I really rely mostly on my experience. So the speaker asked, would you want to stay with this doctor? Would you want to proceed, or would you want to get out of there and find somebody else? Given that he or she is expressing so little interest in the research, would you even be thinking, this sounds, the expression malpractice comes to mind. Okay. Okay, now let's just go over to psychotherapy. Suppose you went to a psychotherapist and you asked the same question. So it's, you're there for the first time and you're asking, do they read the journals? Do they read the latest research, particularly the latest outcome research on which treatments are best for which conditions? And they tell you the same thing. They say, well, bit of that, but basically I rely on my experience, on what I've learned on the basis of experience. Same question. Would you want to stay with that person? Or might you want to go and find somebody who answers the question, yes, I stay up to date on the journals, I read all the latest outcome studies on what's best for what conditions? I think you might be thinking, think I'm going to find somebody else. So he's saying this, and the crowd is nodding. Oh, yeah. This is That's obvious. That's the obvious thing to do. Well, I'm sitting there and I'm having a different reaction. Okay, so I've heard this many times. This is academic gospel, really. But I had a different reaction. My reaction was more, hold on. Yeah, I do some things that are empirically supported. I happen to like prolonged exposure therapy as an example. I happen to like EMDR as an example, different exposure therapies. But really, most of what I do is not based on any outcome study, yet it still feels to me like it rests on pretty solid ground. Okay? Actually, most of it feels like it rests on more secure epistemic grounds, knowledge grounds, than the ESTs. Okay, well, is there something wrong with me? Am I suffering delusions of grandeur? Do I know better than science? Am I some kind of Luddite? What's the deal here? What's to be made of me? So in this talk, I wanted to flesh this feeling out, this feeling like, no, there are so many other things that are as secure or more secure than these outcome studies. So that's what this is all about today. Okay, so reading the thesis from the program here. In this talk, I will argue the thesis that rigorous, strongly reasoned psychotherapeutic practice rests not only and not always on outcome research, but on many further equally and in some cases more secure epistemic foundations. Okay. So first slide, scale of justified belief, showing now. Okay. All right, so this is a scale that of the levels of certainty of different knowledge sources. And this comes from mainstream epistemology, people who study knowledge and, certainty, how secure are different kinds of knowledge and so forth. So ranked from most to least certain is knowledge yielded by the following epistemic sources. So we'll start with the most certain knowledge source, epistemic source. Okay, so that is level 1 here, analytic a priori knowledge. Okay, by common consensus, that's the most secure kind of knowledge that we have. So reading a little here about what this is about. Analytic a priori knowledge takes a number of forms, all of which by definition do not involve empirical observation. First, the proposition of mathematics, both those that are self-evident, 2 + 2 = 4, and those that are proven are by common consensus a priori in nature. When true, they are universally regarded as necessarily true and subject neither to rational doubt nor to empirical disconfirmation. Second, the propositions of logic in its various forms are also, by common consensus, not empirical, but a priori in nature. This is true both for those that are self-evidently true, for example, Aristotle's quote, opposite assertions cannot both be true at the same time. For those that follow deductively from valid premises, so for example, if all members of the set A are members of the set B and all members of set B are members of set C, then all the members of A are members of C. And thirdly, here onto this heading, those that are tautologically true by virtue of the fact that the subject of the proposition conceptually implies the predicate. For example, all bachelors are single. In general, propositions of the foregoing kinds are not only regarded as necessarily true and certain, but when applied with valid premises in real-world contexts, the deductive conclusions issuing from them are also regarded as necessarily true. Famously, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, it follows necessarily that Socrates is mortal. Okay. All right, so that's all philosophy. Let's go to psychology and talk about logical a priori knowledge in psychotherapy contexts. First thing here you see is contention. Major schools of therapy rest on logical, not empirical foundations. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit more reading, then I'm going to break from that and not do some stuff it's not reading. Okay, the core procedural principle of cognitive therapies. Okay, that's, CBT is everything today. So let's talk about cognitive therapy, that part of CBT. The core procedural principle of cognitive therapies, that is, the core principle upon which therapist actions are based, is that one should assist clients to eliminate or modify maladaptive beliefs and ideas and to adopt more adaptive alternative ones. Conventionally, this therapy is thought to rest on an empirically supported cognitive theory. However, it's easy to see that it rests on a truism that adaptive beliefs, that is to say, beliefs that work, that are functional, that when acted upon lend themselves to better outcomes, are to be preferred to maladaptive ones, that is, ones that bring about the opposite outcomes. Such a proposition is self-evident. It is true by definition. Adaptive is, by definition, better than maladaptive. What works is, by definition, better than what does not work, and so forth. Such a proposition neither requires empirical support, nor could one seriously entertain the validity of any empirical outcome that supported its opposite, much less the logically entailed implication that therapists should assist their clients in arriving at maladaptive beliefs. Okay. All right, so that's about cognitive therapy, the C and CBT. Just plug in behaviors, talk about adaptive versus non-adaptive behaviors for behaviorism, the B in CBT. Family systems, just plug into that, just what I said, just plug in adaptive versus maladaptive family structural patterns. Okay, same argument. Okay. Okay, so next point, logical thinking in therapy. There we go. Okay. Rigorous clinical thinking embodies the correct application of valid logical forms of inference and argument. Thus, a clinician must have an at least implicit command of these logical forms. For example, a simple, non-empirical logical form has it that if A is causing, i.e. is maintaining the existence of, if A is causing B, and A is removed, B will be correspondingly removed. Okay. So let's go to a very simple case to talk about this. So some time ago, I saw this young man, and he came in. He was very disturbed by something that had happened. He worked in an office where he and a girlfriend a few years previously, they had gotten together and they had a relationship and went on for a while. But after a while, he kind of tired of the relationship and he discontinued it. And he moved on And actually, some months later, he met another woman and really fell in love with her and was very, very happy, not at all sorry that he left the previous and that he'd moved on. Okay. So all was fine until one day, his ex, we'll call her, he walks by her desk. They still work on the same place, and he sees a message on her computer, and it's an email from a friend of hers that says, so glad you met Joe, new guy. So glad you met Joe. Sounds promising. Hope it works out. Good luck, Susie. All right, so he reads this. So she's got a new beau here. He says, it just really disturbed me. I don't know why. It just got under my skin. I've been obsessed with this now for the last few weeks. I don't know why. It's like I went to therapy. I went to see somebody before I came to you. And she said, well, maybe you have some unresolved grief for her. And that just didn't resonate. So I thought I'd come to you and see if you had any better ideas. Okay. So we explored this. And so after a while, it sounded for all the world like what really bothered him was, what if my ex has met a man who compares very favorably with me? He's a better person. Maybe he's better in other ways, which shall go unnamed here. That's what really bothers me. What if she thinks he's the best ever, not me? So, so I said, this is called simple therapy. I said, well, do you know she feels this way? And he said, no, I have no idea. I said, well, do you know any people that she knows? And he says, yeah, we have lots of common friends. I said, well, is there anybody who would give you the lowdown here, that would tell you? Well, yeah, several people. I said, well, go ask them. Here's your homework. Go ask them. So he comes back a week later. He's happy. He said, well, I checked it out. And she still believes I'm the best thing that ever happened to her. And he was very, very happy. That was it. That's all he needed. That was termination. Okay. So what am I talking about here? Talking about, first of all, it's the application of a simple, if A is causing B and A is removed, B will be corresponding to. It's the result of logical, just simple logic. You applying logic in psychotherapy, very simple example. But the case example illustrates a number of further points. First of all, a lot of clients come in with idiosyncratic problems. Like this gentleman came in with an idiosyncratic problem. That problem is not in DSM. Okay, you're not going to find it there. These idiosyncratic problems, thus, have never been subject to outcome studies. Outcome studies focus almost entirely on DSM disorders. So guess what? There's no outcome studies on these things. And that's such a large proportion of therapy cases. Furthermore, ESTs often prove unsuccessful. If you have a good one, a good solid perfectly supportive therapy like prolonged exposure therapy is a good example. And you know what you're doing, that's always assumed. You're competent, you know how to do it. You might be successful 70% of the time, according to the research. Well, that means 30% of the time, you're not going to be successful. So what are you going to do when that 30% kicks in? The exposure therapy didn't work. What do you got now? Well, I think you're going to need to devise, using logic, alternative interventions that are custom tailored to the client's precise situation. you're going to need to go beyond outcome studies here. So you'd be pretty lost without the ability to think things through here logically. Okay, so logic has a huge place in psychotherapy, and it's a more secure kind of knowledge in general than that attributable to outcome studies, which we'll come to. Okay, so level 2. Level 2 knowledge. So the second most secure, the second most certain kind of knowledge is empirical observation. Okay, so reading here. Next in the order of confidence with which we may place credence in propositions are those that are based on empirical observation. Indeed, for the scientists, such observations are universally regarded as the ultimate evidential bedrock for the adequacy of his or her conclusions. Further, we assign such confidence to empirical generalizations that we form by inductive inference from such observations. DNA will continue to replicate proteins in the future. Planets will continue to prescribe elliptical orbits about their suns. Finally, with respect to empirical observation, we assign considerable confidence to propositions that are logically deducible from such observation. Okay. All right. So empirical observation, second most secure. So what's this got to do with therapy? So let's talk about direct observation here in therapy context. So our next heading. Yeah. And one more. Yeah, direct observation. Okay. So certain facts about my client. For example, that he sits leaning forward on the front edge of his chair, that he makes repeated statements of an intensely self-hating nature, and that he expresses despair at the possibility of gaining relief from his long-standing depression are all matters of considerable certainty to me. Okay, now the accuracy of what he's saying we'll get to later. That's a slightly different matter. So good psychotherapy is an intensely empirical activity itself. It requires a scrupulous attention to observation in the therapy hour and an ability to respond to the client on the basis of such observation. Okay, so one of the analogies I always think about is chess. So you're playing a game of chess. What's required? You have to pay a whole lot of attention to what the other person does, to what moves they are making. And what you do rests on that. What you do as a response to, rests on, has everything to do with what they do. So you have to be a careful, direct observer of what the client is doing and saying. So the contents of this firsthand observation are the most certain empirical knowledge therapists have about their clients and are very often the only information that they have to act on. So for example, I did crisis work at the beginning of my career. So somebody would walk in. I had never met them before. They were a walk-in. They were suicidal. Maybe I'd sit with them for an hour or maybe longer, 2 hours. And at the end of that time, I have to make decisions. Should I hospitalize? Can we get him out of this state of lethality that he or she is in? Everything I know is based on direct observation. So I've been sitting here for now. Seeing what the person is doing, seeing what the person's saying, see how he looks, etc. And that's what I'm acting on. Okay. So it's the only thing I have. I don't have an outcome study. So finally, this direct observational knowledge is a necessary prerequisite for the rational selection of optimal treatment procedures to begin with. No treatment, empirically supported or otherwise, can be successful if it is not selected and selected appropriately in the first place on the basis of this empirical observation. So ESTs are not basic in this sense. They're not our first knowledge. They're not our basic knowledge. They rest on observation, and it's up to us to make sure that's the best possible observation. Okay, so here you see something called, next item here is something, you see it already. Okay, go back. Oops, backwards. There we go. Okay, empirical truisms. Okay. So, so these are used in a different way in the I'll call it theoretical orientation that I prefer. Okay, but here I'm just using them in a certain way. I'm using them to designate utterly familiar, taken for granted, first-hand generalizations, like dropped objects will fall to earth. Okay. That have a very high certitude and that go largely unnoticed in clinical thinking. Okay, so a couple of examples here. There's many of these, but I'll just mention two. So if a person does something, he or she must have had a reason or reasons for doing it. Okay. If a person becomes angry, he must have taken that he was provoked, for example, insulted, cheated, or betrayed in some way. Okay. Empirical truisms are sewn intimately into the thinking of the actions of therapists. For example, when a person reveals that she has left her husband after 20 years, we really cannot but take it that she did so for reasons. It's like, it's like we don't stop and say, let me see, might this have been for reasons or might there have been no reasons at all here? We don't do that. It's like that's sewn into our thinking. It's a truism, okay? It's there. We don't think about it. It's just how we think. So scientists do not do studies to establish such truths. Indeed, if they did so and obtained disconfirming evidence, no one would believe it. Consider, for example, studies that claim to show that people often leave their spouses after many years of marriage for no reason at all, or that people are angered by remarks that they perceive as entirely innocuous. Okay. To borrow a phrase, clinicians hold these truths to be self-evident and weave them invisibly into the fabric of their thinking about how best to understand their clients and what they need. Okay, so that's level 2 knowledge. So let's move to level 3. Okay, so here we have established non-probabilistic scientific theory. Okay, non-probabilistic scientific theory. So here, think what's commonly goes by the notion of hard science. Things like relativity theory, evolutionary theory, the Big Bang, cosmology, etc. Okay, so these are a little less certain because it's there's something called fallibilism, which states that no matter how there was Newton, everybody thought Newton had it nailed for all time, but didn't prove quite true. So there's some fallibility here, but in general, they're held with very high degrees of certitude by people. So accordingly, the theoretical propositions of the most established of these scientific theories, theories like evolution, fall next on our scale of confidence. They're level 3 here. So therapeutic activity based on established, next heading here, therapeutic activity based on established non-probabilistic scientific theory. Next heading, none. There isn't any. At the present time, there are no psychotherapeutic treatment procedures whose efficacy is either A, itself based on non-probabilistic research, or B, is based on knowledge derived from established non-probabilistic scientific theory. Accordingly, there are no outcome studies that would meet the standards required to qualify as level 3 knowledge, which takes us to level 4. Okay, so here we have established probabilistic scientific findings and theories. Okay. So given the nature of their subject matter, sciences such as psychology, economics, and sociology characteristically issue their findings in probabilistic terms. They conclude, not that initial conditions X will inevitably result in outcome Y, but that there is such and such a probability that this will be the case. This being the evidential base, propositions generated by these sciences as theoretical law statements, as discrete findings, and as pragmatic implications are less certain than those in level 3 and must always be couched in probabilistic terms. So, next heading, therapeutic activity based on probabilistic scientific findings and theories. And under this next heading, therapy outcome studies. So here we come to therapy outcome studies. So here I want to talk about a kind of a landmark study that came out a few years ago, done by a man named Sokoluk et al. Okay. And what Sokoluk et al. Did was they reviewed a very large number of therapy outcome studies. Excuse me. And what they were looking for were ones that met 2 basic conditions. Condition number 1 is that they were well executed. The study was well done. It was methodologically sound. So that was the first criterion, first thing they were looking for. Secondly, they were looking for studies that yielded findings of strong clinical significance. Okay, so they're looking for studies that didn't just make some minor clinically insignificant difference, some difference that really didn't make much of a difference, but it had to be some outcome that indicate, suggested this is therapeutically important. This is significant. Their conclusion was very few studies meet such standards. Very few of our outcome studies meet these standards, these basic standards. So there's not a lot of good outcome studies out there by the criterion we're using. Further, they noticed, very few of these studies are replicated. So they're not, done again to establish, yes, our findings are sound. Okay. So, and here they did note 2 exceptions. Said there's studies of prolonged exposure therapy, and there's studies of cognitive processing theory that meet both of these standards. So they said, these are the gold standard here. These are the guys, These are the people who got it right in their studies. They're methodologically sound, and what they have to say is therapeutically important, significant. Okay. All right, so next heading. So we go to level 5, level down here, anecdotal evidence. So this is evidence that is based on personal observations that have been collected in a non-systematic manner, rather than on the basis of systematic scientific investigation. So anecdotal evidence. It's really hard to locate on this scale, and just and I'd say different anecdotal evidence along, is more or less certain. So quick examples. So one of my observations over the years, people who come in with somatic problems are going to be poor reporters of what's going on with them. It's going to be hard to get them to articulate, here's my problem, here's how I feel, here's how it links to my relationship to my mother, whatever. Okay, so now I would assign that pretty weak certitude. Okay. On the other hand, I think of the work of Edwin Schneidman, who for decades sat down with suicidal patients, did therapy with them, and recorded his observations on this in a number of books. He didn't do studies. So technically everything he did counts as anecdotal evidence. Yet, okay, this is my personal conclusion. I read this. Does it square with my experience? Yes, it does. Does the guy really seem to have it nailed? Seems so to me. There's no studies there, but it's anecdotally, and yet I say, I think this is pretty secure stuff. Okay. So things here, I think, fall at different levels, not all at one level. Okay. So next, I might just say one more thing about anecdotal. Is a lot of what we study in school comes from, like we study like solution focused therapy today. Not a lot of studies, but you read it and you say, and of course you try it, which is a whole other matter here. And my conclusion, like, pretty solid stuff, makes sense on its face, and hey, when you do it, it works. All right, level 6, knowledge, intuition, hunch, and impression. So here I'm just going to say this is the lowest level. I think it's important. Sometimes you get intuitions, and sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're wrong. So I wouldn't want to say, okay, I never want another intuition here. I never want another hunch. I never want another depression. I want them, but on this scale here, they're at the lowest level. Okay, so just gonna put them there. So moving along to the next heading. So all I'm saying here is these are the lowest level. That's all I want to say. So we'll move on to some other matters here. So these are knowledge bases in therapy that are indispensable. You really can't get along without them, but they're kind of difficult to classify here. First of these is client self-reports. Problems with the accuracy and thus credibility, just checking the time here, of self-reports are a concern for clinicians. However, they're also a concern for researchers in the same way. You need clients to report, I feel better, I feel worse. That intervention made absolutely no difference. it hangs on self-report. Anyway, so problems with the accuracy and thus credibility of self-reports are a concern for clinicians. People, clients, may be biased, and research subjects may be biased, may be defensive, may deceive, may forget, may answer in socially desirable ways, and more. Okay. So there's these questions, about client self-reports. Two comments. However, they're an indispensable source of knowledge. Obviously, we can't function without them. This is true in therapy, and it's true in research. Okay. So the researcher can't claim any advantage here. Okay. Secondly, given their indispensability plus inability to fact check, the matter must devolve into one of assessing how much credence can be placed in any given client self-report. So we have to, it's really so much about judgment and sensitivity in terms of assessing how good is the client's self-report, something we have to do, and it's an uncertain proposition. Okay. But there's good news. That said, many therapy clients are acting under conditions favorable to accurate reporting. First of all, they initiate voluntarily. So we're talking about voluntary clients. They come to you in pain. They're depressed. They're horribly anxious. They have GAD, whatever. They have PTSD. So they have serious problems. So they have pretty strong motivation to try to figure out what they need to do to overcome these problems. Further, they often form positive, trusting relationships with their therapists. So that lends itself to, trying to tell the truth, trying to provide accurate reporting. Frequently, they admit negative things about themselves, such as personal inadequacies, socially undesirable feelings, blameworthy actions, self-loathing. Thus displaying in these cases, there's no blanket social desirability motive when you're seeing this sort of thing. Okay. So a lot of that, you have all those things going for you. If you have all those things going for you with a given client, certainly lends itself to, they're probably telling the truth. It's probably a good report here. Okay. So obviously some clients lie. Some clients omit important materials. Some clients distort reality and or fail to observe and report well. The point here is that self-report information is indispensable and arguably, under the right conditions, reasonably trustworthy. Okay. I'm just labeling it hard to classify, but under those conditions, reasonably trustworthy, have all the good things going. Okay, next, cultural knowledge. The degree to which cultural knowledge enters into the practice of psychotherapy would be difficult to overstate. In our own cultures, we know the language, we know the idioms, we understand the societal context, such as the institutions. We know about marriage in our culture, we know about the family, we know about the educational system. Okay. We know about social practices in our culture. We know about conversation, we know about dating, we know about negotiating issues, we know about making promises. So we have this cultural knowledge of all these things. We know the normative significance if a client comes in and says, my intended broke off our engagement this week. Okay. Or if they come in and say, I'm here because I'm suffering massive social ostracism at school. Or if they say, I'm here because my spouse is having an affair. So we have a lot of knowledge about if we're well socialized, about the ordinary implications, the ordinary significance of these things. We can't be sure. Maybe the woman's happy her husband's having an affair, good riddance. But we know about the normative significance that we bring that knowledge to the session, and more often than not, that's going to be the case, that the person is disturbed, even traumatized by the discovery that her spouse is having an affair. Maybe he's been carrying it on for a few years, this sort of thing. Okay. We know the client's behavior is socially inappropriate, because we know a lot about appropriate versus inappropriate behavior. We know the client's behavior is socially inappropriate and thereby often maladaptive. If they are, for example, exploding angrily at others, boasting all the time about themselves, or exploiting others. Without this incredibly vast and rich tapestry of cultural knowledge, therapists could not begin to understand their clients. I couldn't find any research on this, but I think it's reasonable to assume that most therapists, at least especially in their own cultures, know much of the above with a very substantial degree of accuracy and are able to act on this knowledge with considerable confidence. With respect to other cultures, okay, ordinarily, probably most of us are not so strong. So we have to, learn from the client, learn from studying other cultures. Okay. But certainly with respect to our own culture, we know a lot, and we bring that we know it with a fair amount of certitude, and we bring that into our exchange with the client. And without it, we wouldn't understand. With a lot of things, we wouldn't begin to understand. Okay. Final heading here. Knowledge derived from clinical practice. And here I'm referring to our own clinical practice. So really, it's hard to classify this. It's really a mixture of all of the above. I think most of us, over the years, we assemble, an amalgam of what works for us, what procedures, what ideas, how to think about certain things, what are some repeating patterns. We figure out what works for us. So in the end, if we've really paid attention, what we have is a really heavily empirically based kind of knowledge with elements of all kinds, but ones that have worked for us in our work with clients. Okay, hard to classify that. So, conclusion. In this presentation, a portrayal of many epistemic foundations upon which clinical judgment and intervention rest have been drawn. On the present view, all of these epistemic sources are valuable and all indispensable. That is to say, we could not undertake psychotherapy successfully if we eliminated any of them from our personal knowledge bases. Consider, for example, eliminating the use of logic, of direct observation, or of cultural knowledge. Finally, all represent knowledge sources that, in the hands of skilled, careful, knowledgeable clinicians, may be assigned, albeit at differing levels, substantial credibility. Thus, in the end, a portrait of therapeutic judgment and action emerges that shows such judgment and action to rest not only and not always on the results of outcome studies, but on many further secure epistemic foundations. Thank you.